The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Okay.
Honourable David Cunliffe.
I rise to take a call in this third reading of the Westpac New Zealand bill and to confirm that the Labour opposition will be supporting this bill because it is important to ensure that the New Zealand banking system remains strong and stable, and that this bill gives effect to one component of that financial security, which is to ensure that locally incorporated subsidiaries are of sufficient scale to provide good risk management within our system pursuant to the regulations of the New Zealand Reserve Bank. Mr. Speaker, I want to firstly to draw on the submission by Westpac itself in taking the House through the reasons why this bill is necessary, and then to note several important contextual issues that surround it. Mr. Speaker, Westpac in some form or other has operated in New Zealand for 150 years or so. Westpac New Zealand Limited is a locally incorporated subsidiary of Westpac Banking Corporation headquartered in Australia, which has only operated in New Zealand since 2006. And it did so pursuant to regulations passed by the New Zealand Reserve Bank. Westpac New Zealand Limited conducts Westpac Banking Corporation's retail operations in New Zealand, and that includes consumer and business banking, while the Westpac Banking Corporation branch, the Australian-owned branch, conducts the institutional business. Now, under the regulations, that institutional business is subject to a cap of $15 billion of assets and liabilities, excluding those to related parties, which is known as the liabilities cap. The Reserve Bank imposes on branches of overseas banks, such as Westpac Banking Corporation New Zealand, a condition of registration that restricts them from having liabilities in excess of that cap in order to ensure that the foreign-owned entity does not become, quote, systemically important, unquote, in the New Zealand system, i.e. if the foreign-owned entity is too big, sir, and the market enters another period of considerable turbulence, then the risks go up to New Zealanders that too much of the asset book is held in foreign hands. That's why we have the rule, and that's why a proportion of the assets and liabilities currently held by the Australian-owned parent directly are being transferred through this bill to the New Zealand incorporated subsidiary, and that's a very important difference. So what's being transferred? Some institutional customer deposits, some institutional customer transactional banking, some institutional customer lending, some debt capital markets, and some corporate advisory functions. Of course, sir, it does bring to the fore the broader question of why not more of Westpac Banking Corporation New Zealand's assets and liabilities should not be transferred into the New Zealand subsidiary, and why it's in the interests of the bank to maintain a dual structure. Not the only one that does, ANZ does, and Commonwealth Bank of Australia and Rabobank also do, maintain that dual structure between a foreign-owned entity and a New Zealand incorporated subsidiary. And so it may well be that in future that's an issue that this House needs to turn its mind to, or that a future government might wish to turn its mind to in consultation with the banking industry. But for now, sir, the Labour opposition is satisfied that the provisions of this bill are in keeping with the object of the Act and in keeping with the Reserve Bank's policy to ensure a reasonable level of financial security and stability in New Zealand. And for that reason, we support the bill. Mr. Speaker, I wish to turn briefly to the economic context within which this transfer is taking place. And it's important in doing so to acknowledge that the banking system is of huge importance to New Zealand. That 95% of that banking system, approximately, I think now 93 actually to be precise, is owned by entities not headquartered in New Zealand, foreign-owned as it were, including notably the big four Australian banks. The exceptions to that rule are Kiwi Bank, started by the former Labour-led government, which has about 5% of the market, and other smaller entities like the TSB Bank and PSIS and other locally based organisations. Mr. Speaker, New Zealand is too indebted. That's a theme that we've heard a lot from the government. They, of course, before the budget came out with that figure of $380 million of Crown borrowing a week, turned out it was only 280. The other 100 was purely discretionary, timing-based. But, Mr. Speaker, that hides the larger truth, and perhaps deliberately does so, that most of the international investment deficit, our net debt as a nation, is not Crown debt. It is not public debt. It is not debt owed by the taxpayer. It's debt owed by individuals through the banking system, some 55% of which has been invested in house mortgages, sir. New Zealanders went, I think it's common ground across the House, went on a bit of a house buying binge over the previous decade.
Western world did.
The whole Western world did, that's exactly right. And probably no government in the Western world quite appreciated the size of the housing bubble while it was on. But now that bubble has come to the end of its peak, and we are dealing collectively with how best to unwind it. Mr. Speaker, it's clear that if 90% of our total debt is private and only 10% is public, that no amount of cost-cutting in the public sector is going to solve the private debt problem. By logic, if the Crown's budget was cut by 50%, that would save only 5% of the total because it's only off a base of 10%. And that, Mr. Speaker, is a tremendously important idea for New Zealanders to get their heads around. Mr. Speaker, New Zealanders are borrowing too much, and they're also borrowing it for the wrong purposes. The breakdown of that private debt, which is owned by the banking system, including Westpac, shows that to be true. As I said, about 55% in house mortgages, some 25% in farm debt, which is, well, it's plateaued, hasn't decreased, despite record prices for many commodities. I think a 27-year record at the current time. And some 16% of it, if I recall correctly, is other business debt and various miscellaneous other components. The point, sir, is that New Zealand is over-indebted and that we're going to need to think very carefully about how to unwind that problem. Owning our future as a country means getting the debt down by changing the economic incentives that have created the problem of property speculation and the resultant over-borrowing. There are many ways to do that, sir, and the Labour opposition will be laying out for the nation the strategy that we have been working on within the next several months so that New Zealanders can get their head around what real systemic change would look like and to compare that to the, shall we charitably say, steady as she goes option, which is offered by the current government. Speaker, on this legislation, it's important to ensure that Westpac New Zealand has a sound and stable New Zealand operation while enjoying the benefits of linking to its trans-Tasman parent, such as access to capital. And I do want to acknowledge the role of Westpac and of the other major banks in standing behind New Zealand needs during the financial crisis. Mr. Speaker, while the immediate crisis is over, the challenges facing our economy remain. And we look forward as a Labour opposition and as an incoming government to working closely with the banking system to find the win-wins, to work out how we can, to the profit of the financial sector as well as the real economy, grow the pie for all New Zealanders to ensure healthy growth, more New Zealanders in jobs, might also be said more tax revenues in the Crown's coffers as a result, less people on benefits and rising all boats. We know that to do that successfully we need a real plan for growth. We know that rising inequality would not and should not be part of that plan. We know that simply selling the family silver is not a substitute for a real plan. We know that a real plan must incorporate progress on the real economy, the export sector in particular, as well as improving our savings picture and the health of our financial system. Mr. Speaker, if we're trying to improve our savings system, why would we be cutting incentives to KiwiSaver? Why would we be foregoing contributions to the largest single accumulator of savings, which is the New Zealand Superannuation Fund? And isn't it about time that we had a government that was more committed to a strong savings policy? And the Labour opposition will be releasing its savings package before the election. I think it's fair to say that it will be significantly bolder than that announced by the government in the current budget. Mr. Speaker, the opposition supports this bill. It's important that we do have a substantial part of the assets of the banking systems locally incorporated in New Zealand. This bill affects that for Westpac New Zealand, and we support its passage in this third reading.